Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to do a quick overview of the medieval period. We'll talk a little bit about medieval philosophy, but mostly this is just going to be a mile-high overview of this period of medieval history, of which our philosophy course will take place. You may ask yourself, well, why do we need to cover a lot of these seemingly esoteric historical things? Well, there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the medieval period. A lot of people don't quite understand just how influential the medieval period was to our modern day. And a lot of people, much like this meme here, assume that the medieval period is full of people who have no understanding of the world, no education, and that this was a dark age, right? So we're hopefully going to dispel some of those myths and also give us just an overview of what's happening. That way we have a background of the philosophy that we're going to encounter. First thing we have to ask when it comes to the medieval period is what separates it from the ancient period. If you've taken ancient philosophy, you learned about, the rise of Rome, you learned about the Greeks, you learned about all these things. So what makes the medieval period different? Well, one thing is we start off the medieval period with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And that fall, loss of administrative control from the top creates a bit of a power vacuum. And we see the rise of a whole bunch of smaller principalities and little states that pop up controlled by, a lord or, some sort of king. And it is an age pretty much all across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East of pretty much constant warfare and immense suffering, right? The Roman Empire, they weren't necessarily good guys. They did a lot of horrible things. But one thing they did do is they kept the power vacuums in line and they kept peace throughout the empire. Once that goes away, particularly in the West, well, we see that start to break up. We also see the rise of the international university system. Some of these names I've got listed: Oxford, Cambridge, University of Paris, University of Salamanca. These are universities that still exist today. They might have had a slight name change or something of that. But we see the rise of that starting very early on with Charlemagne and really solidifying itself by about 1100 AD. This carries on. We start to see a strong collection of faculty. And although modern universities take a lot of flack, one thing that a strong faculty of academics gives you is the ability to make advancements in very narrow, hard to crack disciplines. So that is one thing we see. We also see about 1,000 years of really, really intense study of Plato and Plotinus, Aristotle, Cicero, and all the ancients that they could get their hands on, as well as a lot of developments within the world of theology. Modern Christianity, as we understand it today, in many ways comes from these developments that happened during the medieval period. This sort of marriage of Athens and Jerusalem, this connection of high-minded Neoplatonic ideals with Christian theology becomes a bit of a force to be reckoned with. Let's go through some key points of history. And this isn't the entirety of medieval history. There's a lot of stuff I left out. I went through and just kind of chose the things that I considered most important. But obviously, there were a lot of things that I didn't include. So we have to keep that in mind. Some of these things will come up again, and some of our PowerPoints will have breakdowns of timelines going through things that I didn't cover here. But this is the mile high overview. If you are interested in learning more about medieval history, there are tons of resources you can use. You just have to find the thing you're interested in, do a Google search, and really read to your heart's content because it is interesting. So we start off with 312, and this marks sort of the proto beginning of medieval history. In 312, Constantine becomes Christian and he institutes Christianity in the Roman Empire. Now, by this time, the Roman Empire had become very large, sluggish, and was facing a lot of corruption and administrative problems from within. Constantine becomes Christian. He institutes it as the law of the land. And shortly after that, we start to see the fall of Rome. Now, a lot of contemporary Romans blame this on the Christians, but the problems were there even before Constantine. It just so happens that Christianity was a new kid on the block. 354, Augustine's born. And one thing I didn't list, but we have Augustine, his life goes from 354 to about 430, where he is killed in a siege on the town of Hippo. But that is the really crumbling of the Roman Empire, and by 470, Western Rome is dead. 523, Boethius starts writing the Constellation of Philosophy, and again, we're seeing these kind of vestiges of Rome, but they're really only Roman in name. They're not truly Roman. We're seeing a lot of just small kings and small time petty lords who are trying to fill this power gap. 525, we have the Anno Domini calendar is created. So, when we think of BC and AD, that's when that comes about. 525, reign of Justinian in 527. And we're going to go from Europe over to the Middle East. We have the first Islamic community in Medina in 622. And then by 651, we have the beginning of Islamic conquest. We have the rise of the Islamic nation under the caliphs. And this period of Islamic conquest will continue for another several hundred years. And it's going to eventually be the thing that causes the fall of Constantinople. 800, Charlemagne becomes emperor, and we start having a revival of art. We have the first formalization of universities. We have the first European use of gunpowder uh, by Arabs in 919. And then in 1054, we have the Great Schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, and we cover this in the lecture on Augustine, but the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox had already had a bit of a break around the year 400, but by 1054, that's when it becomes permanent, and the Eastern Orthodox Church stops recognizing the authority of the Pope. 1066, we have the creation of what we now understand as the modern British royal family. It is the Norman conquest of England. Then in 1095, we have the First Crusade to try and retake Jerusalem. Now, we would have three more crusades, and the first one did pretty well, but the others just kind of fell apart. 1135, in the art world, we have the rise of Gothic art and architecture. So think about all the big, beautiful cathedrals that you can imagine. That really starts in 1135. These high vaulted ceilings and massive brick cathedrals. That starts in 1135, and it starts because we have a lot of advancements in construction technology that have been periodically occurring. And I'll talk about some of these scientific advancements as we get into the next slide. But one thing I want to mention is throughout the entirety of the medieval period, we are still seeing scientific and technological advances. A lot of people consider this to be the Dark Age, and they say, oh, well, we had all these advancements under the Romans, and then the Romans fell, and then it was Dark Ages until the Renaissance. But that's not true. It was an incremental improvement over time. One of the big things that the medievals did is they made technological improvements to already existing technologies. So whenever I'm talking about some of these technologies, you'll say, well, this thing technically existed before then, and that's right. But the medieval thinkers were the ones that really kind of perfected it, for lack of a better saying. So that's one thing the medievals did very well, is improving on inventions. 1215, signing of the Magna Carta. And now this is an important thing because this shows the first kind of recognized limits on monarchical power, right? Prior to this, it was just assumed that the divine right of kings allowed for anything that they wanted. But with the signing of the Magna Carta, we start to see a recognition that, hey, even kings have to follow the law. 1233, we have the start of the Spanish Inquisition, and nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition. This technically started, I believe, in France, but then expanded out. But we do see the start of the Inquisition. The Pope at the time was worried about heresies, particularly coming from intermingling between Christians and Jews and Muslims, and started an Inquisition to root out all these heresies. 1295, we have the start of Marco Polo's travels. And if you're not too familiar with Marco Polo, don't worry yourself too much about it. But we do have to realize and recognize that for the people of this time, when Marco Polo's travels eventually get like published and word of mouth starts going around, that's a big deal. That is a huge, huge kind of advancement of knowledge, this kind of understanding of what the rest of the world is like. Sometime between 1250 and 1400, we have the start of the Renaissance. Some people link it to Dante Alighieri's writing of Dante's Inferno, which I believe is in 1237. Other people link it to some construction projects that occurred in the early 1400s. This specific date isn't as important as a recognition that sometime between here and there, we have the start of the Renaissance. 1337, we have the start of the Hundred Years' War between, got a typo there, between England and France. And that lasts for about 100 years and leads to, even today, some, you know, hard feelings between the British and the French. We also have the Battle of Agincourt somewhere in here. I didn't list it, but it is an important event. 1237, we have a major plague. Now, let me say very clearly, the bubonic plague at different points in medieval history has been popping up and dying out, popping up and dying out. This is a very big plague. It kills about 30% of Europe around 1347, but it's not the first time. 1439, we see the printing press, Gutenberg, and this begins the rise of what we might call mass literacy. Prior to the printing press, most people, well, even after the printing press, a lot of people are still illiterate. But thanks to the printing press, we start seeing more and more people being able to get written documents cheaply and easily, which allows more and more people to actually learn to read and write. And pretty much within 100 or 200 years of the printing press, just about every family is going to have a Bible. It might be the only book they own, but they are going to have something in writing that they can read and practice their reading and writing on. 1453, around that time, we have the siege and fall of Constantinople. So at that point, the Western Roman Empire is dead, and now it's the time of the Ottomans. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. This is the start of the age of exploration, age of conquest. And I'm not going to get too far into the weeds with, you know, Columbus and all that, but this is a big deal. It's a big deal back then. It's a big deal right now. The fact that Columbus was able to go from Spain, well, technically Portugal, over to the New World and meet people they'd never encountered, that was a big deal for the people at the time. And it really is one of the catalysts for the Age of Enlightenment, because suddenly they're saying, oh, things are a lot bigger than what we imagined. There's a lot more going on. And perhaps a lot of these older assumptions we had didn't necessarily hold true. We also have the Protestant Reformation starting shortly after this, Luther and his 95 Theses. A whole lot of argument and debate over the practice of Catholic indulgence and papal authority. And although that's not necessarily the key point of this class, you could have a whole class on just the Protestant Reformation. The key thing to remember is that we are starting to see the end of the medieval period and we're starting to see something else. And a big part of that is going to come with the Catholic Church losing even more power, right? So we got to remember Catholic Church was once part of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire falls. Catholic Church is now just a religious institution. Then we have the split between East and West, Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And now we see the Roman Catholic Church breaking apart in the Protestant Reformation. Then in 1533, Francisco Pizarro invades an Incan Empire. And sometime around here, we also have Hernan Cortez, who wipes out the Aztecs. So we're seeing towards this tail end of the medieval period, these wars that have been occurring on the European mainland are now getting transported to the New World. And then in 1637, this is when many people say the Enlightenment officially starts. We have Descartes publishing his discourses. So, just kind of the thing to keep in mind is the medieval period. We cover the whole thing in this one course, but it could really be broken up into like 3 or 4 courses because there's so much happening, not only historically, but philosophically as well. But sadly, there isn't very much market demand for really detailed courses on medieval philosophy. So this is what we get. Another thing with all these things, so we saw all the things happening, and I'm just going to kind of pause here and talk about some of the important medieval developments because, like I said, a lot of people assume it's just the Dark Ages and nothing's happening. There's no science, everyone's just living in the dirt, listening to monks preaching or whatever. But we see the printing press, we see horse collars and spurs, stirrups, and saddles, right? Like one of the things that made the Europeans so deadly in warfare was stirrups and saddles, the ability to ride a horse over rough terrain and run down people that you're fighting with. We see the development of crop and livestock rotation, something still used today, and it had been used in different parts of the world, but the Europeans didn't really start doing it until medieval times when we started seeing the rise of, I don't want to call what you might call a proto factory farm, where we have a farm that is much, much larger, meant to feed a much larger portion of the population than what had been done previously. We see tons of advancements in construction, which is what allows those Gothic cathedrals. And here's the thing, we want to keep this in mind. Think about many of the great buildings of the ancient period, and many of them are just blown out of the water. Most of them are blown out of the water by these Gothic cathedrals, buildings that are massive. They're the skyscrapers of the day, and they're only possible because we have many of these advancements in concrete and architectural techniques. We see various types of cranes, such as a treadwell crane and harbor cranes, which previously just didn't exist. Prior to these crane developments, if you were loading heavy cargo, you had to do it by hand with dudes. We see oil paints, mechanical clocks, dry compasses, and movable rudders, spectacles, right? Like if you're someone that reads with glasses, those didn't come around until medieval times. Various types of armors, cannons, trebuchets, mills, and windmills. These are all things that just did not exist or weren't efficient, right? Because some of these things did exist in the ancient period, but they weren't really efficient to use until they had developments by the medievals done on them, right? So my main point is not that any one of these things is some kind of, well, except maybe the printing press and stirrups, is some kind of like crazy incredible invention. But my main point is that the medieval period is a lot richer and a lot more historically vibrant time period than what a lot of people assume. Kind of getting into the wrap up, during the medieval period, we see what happens when philosophers in particular focus really strongly on certain things. And they're using a shared tool set and they're focusing on logic, metaphysics, math, science, theology, and they're making great strides in it. We also see what a what the world might look like if it was looked at through the lens of Plato and Aristotle. Again, completely different kind of view, right? And we see very strong hierarchical societies. We see a lot of absolute monarchs. We see the Catholic Church really hierarchical. But we also see the rise of human rights literature and the development of political philosophy and political ethics. And, these might sound like minor things, right? But prior to the medieval period, there was no arguments against slavery, at least no very well-known ones of which I'm aware of. In the early medieval period, we start to see arguments, Christian arguments against slavery by folks such as Athanasius, and that's all the way back in like uh, 200 AD, right? We start to see arguments against colonial intervences, and we see arguments against the Crusades. We see a lot of developments of ethics and human rights literature that just did not exist before. And that I think is probably the most important advancement from medieval philosophy is this idea that someone has rights and someone has freedoms just on their nature of being a human, not necessarily because of anything else. And, let me say this, it wasn't perfect and it wasn't uniformly distributed, but we do start to see the birth of these ideas, which previously just didn't exist. So, overall, I hope that this has been an educational lecture for you. I know it's gone really fast and covered a lot of material, but the goal was to help prep you for the Philosophy 303 course, as well as any other courses that you might be taking where the medieval period is covered. With that being said, thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.